I woke up from emergency gallbladder surgery to find a suitcase already packed and sitting by our front door, my husband's face carrying an expression I'd never once seen directed at me in 9 years of marriage. And the first words out of his mouth weren't, "How are you feeling?" They were, "I know about the affair, and I want you gone by tonight." I hadn't had an affair. It took me 3 devastating months to understand that my own mother-in-law had spent that entire time constructing one, piece by fabricated piece, specifically timed to land, while I was too physically weak to properly defend myself. My name is Vanessa, and this is the story of the strangest, most disorienting betrayal I've ever experienced. Not from a stranger, not even really from my husband directly, but from a mother-in-law who decided, for reasons I'm still working to fully understand even now, that destroying my marriage was worth fabricating evidence of a crime I never actually committed. I want to explain what my relationship with my mother-in-law, Patricia, looked like before this happened, because I think the specific texture of that relationship matters to understanding how something this elaborate could unfold without me recognizing the danger sooner. Patricia and I had never been close, exactly, but our relationship, for most of my 9 years married to her son Derek, had settled into what I genuinely believed was a functional, if somewhat cool, mutual tolerance, the kind of relationship many daughters-in-law navigate without it ever escalating into anything more concerning than occasional friction over holiday plans or parenting opinions. What I understand now, with the benefit of everything that eventually came to light, is that Patricia had never actually accepted me as a genuine, permanent part of Derek's life, holding on to a specific, persistent hope throughout our entire marriage that Derek would eventually reconnect with his college girlfriend, a woman named Christine whom Patricia had, according to what I later learned, remained close friends with throughout the entire 9 years of my marriage to her son, a detail I had absolutely no knowledge of until this entire situation forced it into the open. I want to describe what my relationship with Derek looked like throughout our 9 years of marriage, because I think it matters to understanding just how completely disorienting it was to have that entire foundation apparently upended within the span of a single week. We'd built, I genuinely believed, a solid, communicative partnership, two working professionals, me in graphic design, Derek in project management. No children yet, though we'd begun discussing the possibility more seriously over the preceding year, a marriage that, while not without its ordinary friction, had never once, in 9 years, involved anything approaching the level of crisis I was about to face. I want to describe the specific medical crisis that set this entire devastating sequence in motion, because the timing itself, once I understood the full picture, felt disturbingly calculated rather than simply coincidental. I'd been experiencing worsening abdominal pain for several weeks, eventually diagnosed with severe gallstones requiring emergency surgical removal, a procedure that, while not life-threatening, required a genuinely difficult recovery period involving significant pain, limited mobility, and the kind of physical vulnerability that made me, for several weeks following the surgery, considerably more dependent on Derek's support than I'd ever needed to be throughout our entire marriage. I underwent the surgery on a Tuesday, spending one night in the hospital before being discharged the following afternoon into what I expected would be a difficult but manageable recovery period at home, supported by my husband during a time I genuinely believed our marriage's foundation remained exactly as solid as it had always seemed. I want to describe the specific, disorienting moment I woke up from anesthesia in that hospital room, still groggy and in pain, to find Derek sitting beside my bed with an expression I initially attributed to simple worry about my surgery. Before understanding, over the following minutes, that whatever was actually troubling him had nothing to do with my medical procedure at all. "We need to talk," he said, his voice carrying a strange, controlled tightness. "But not here. Not right now, while you're still recovering from anesthesia. I just need you to know that things are going to be different when we get home." I remember lying in that hospital bed, still processing the physical aftermath of surgery, trying and failing to understand what Derek might mean by this cryptic, unsettling statement, assuming, in my drugged, exhausted state, that perhaps some household emergency had occurred during my hospitalization, something practical rather than anything touching the fundamental stability of our marriage itself. I was discharged the following afternoon, still moving carefully, still managing significant post-surgical pain, and it was upon arriving home, walking through our own front door still supported by Derek's arm, that I found the suitcase sitting there, already packed, clearly prepared in advance of my actual arrival. "Derek, what is this?" I asked, genuine confusion still clouding whatever instinct should have immediately recognized the danger in what I was looking at. "I know about you and Marcus," he said, his voice cracking slightly despite what appeared to be his effort to maintain composure. "I know about the affair, Vanessa. I want you gone tonight." I want to try to describe the specific, vertiginous shock of hearing an accusation this serious, this completely unfounded, directed at me by my own husband while I was still recovering from major surgery, barely able to stand upright without support, utterly unprepared to mount any kind of coherent defense against an accusation I couldn't even begin to understand the origin of. Derek, I have no idea who Marcus even is. I haven't had an affair. What is happening right now? What followed was one of the most disorienting conversations of my entire life. Derek producing, over the following exhausting hour, what he described as evidence. Text messages he claimed had been forwarded to him from an anonymous source. Photographs supposedly showing me with a man I genuinely didn't recognize. A detailed, specific narrative about an affair I had absolutely no knowledge of ever being part of. I remember sitting on our living room couch, still moving carefully given my post-surgical incisions, watching Derek scroll through his phone with shaking hands, showing me image after image, each one landing with a fresh wave of confused, disoriented horror. The photographs showed a woman who genuinely resembled me, standing close to an unfamiliar man in what appeared to be a hotel hallway, an embrace that, from the composition and framing, suggested something clearly beyond platonic. I stared at those images, my post-surgical pain suddenly feeling distant and unimportant compared to the specific vertigo of looking at what appeared to be photographic evidence of my own infidelity, evidence I had absolutely no memory of any corresponding real event to explain. I want to describe the specific horror of looking at evidence of my own supposed infidelity and recognizing none of it as connected to my actual life in any way, while simultaneously watching my husband's face carry complete, devastated conviction that what he was showing me represented undeniable proof of a betrayal I hadn't committed. Derek, I need you to look at me. Whatever you're looking at, whatever anyone's told you, none of this is real. I don't know this man. I've never had an affair. Please, just slow down and actually look at what you're accusing me of. He wouldn't slow down. I understand now, with considerably more clarity than I possessed during that devastating initial confrontation, that Derek had spent the preceding several days, throughout my hospital stay and recovery, being systematically fed this fabricated narrative by someone who had clearly invested significant time and effort into constructing something detailed and convincing enough to override 9 years of accumulated trust in his own wife. I left our house that evening, still in significant post-surgical pain, moving carefully with a suitcase I hadn't packed myself, staying with my own sister for what I initially assumed would be a brief, temporary separation while whatever misunderstanding had occurred got sorted out through calmer, more rational conversation once the initial shock had subsided for both of us. I want to describe the following days, attempting repeatedly to have the kind of clear, evidence-based conversation that should have quickly resolved an accusation this unfounded, only to find Derek increasingly resistant to actually examining the supposed evidence with any real scrutiny. Apparently convinced enough by whatever he'd initially been shown that he'd essentially stopped engaging with any counter-evidence or explanation I attempted to offer. It was my sister, Amanda, who first suggested, about a week into this devastating situation, that we needed to actually trace the specific origin of whatever evidence Derek believed he'd received, rather than simply continuing to argue against accusations whose actual source remained frustratingly unclear. Someone constructed this, Vanessa, Amanda told me, during one of our late-night conversations processing the entire surreal situation. Fake evidence doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Someone specifically built this, and specifically chose to deliver it during the exact week you were most physically vulnerable and least capable of immediately, forcefully defending yourself. That's not random. That's calculated. I hired an attorney roughly 10 days into this crisis, a careful, methodical woman named Ms. Reyes who specialized in exactly this kind of complicated marital dispute. And together we began the process of actually investigating the specific origin and nature of the evidence Derek believed had proven my infidelity. What we discovered, over the following several weeks, was more elaborate and more disturbing than I had initially imagined possible. The photographs Derek had been shown, supposedly depicting me with a man named Marcus, were, upon closer digital forensic examination, composite images, my face, taken from photographs pulled from my own social media accounts, digitally combined with images of an entirely different woman in genuinely compromising situations with a man who, as far as any of us could determine, had no actual connection to me whatsoever. The forensic analyst Ms. Reyes brought in, a careful young man named Devin who specialized in digital image authentication, walked me through the specific technical markers that revealed the manipulation, subtle inconsistencies in lighting and shadow between my face and the rest of the composited image, metadata inconsistencies in the file properties that indicated recent editing software had been used, and, most tellingly, the discovery that the original, unaltered photograph of my face had been pulled directly from a public post on my own social media account, dated over a year before the supposed affair photographs had allegedly been taken. Someone spent real time on this, Devin told me, during our review session, sounding almost reluctantly impressed despite the clearly malicious purpose behind the work. This isn't a quick, sloppy fake. Whoever built this had some genuine skill and access to enough of your actual online presence to make the composite convincing enough to survive a first, non-technical glance. The text messages, similarly, turned out to be fabricated screenshots, constructed using widely available software that allows users to create convincing fake text conversation threads, populated with content designed to sound plausibly like something I might say, but containing specific details and phrasings that, once I actually had the opportunity to review them carefully alongside my attorney, contained small, telling inconsistencies, references to locations I'd never visited, inside jokes, and phrasings that didn't match my actual communication style. Details that someone who didn't know me quite as intimately as they perhaps believed had gotten subtly, revealingly wrong. I want to describe the specific, sickening process of tracing this fabricated evidence back to its actual source. A process that eventually, through a combination of digital forensic analysis and old-fashioned, painful family investigation, led directly back to Patricia, my mother-in-law. Amanda was the one who finally broke through the mystery, calling me one evening with a piece of information that reframed the entire preceding month in a completely different light. She had, through a mutual acquaintance, learned that Patricia had recently reconnected extensively with Christine, Derek's college girlfriend, the two of them apparently spending considerable time together over the preceding several months, a detail neither Derek nor I had any previous knowledge of. "I think this is about Christine," Amanda told me. "I think Patricia's been trying to get Derek back together with her for a long time. And I think whatever happened while you were in surgery was specifically timed to give her the best possible opportunity to make that happen while you were too weak and disoriented to properly fight back." I confronted Derek directly with this theory roughly 2 weeks after initially leaving our house, presenting him with the digital forensic analysis my attorney had compiled, clearly demonstrating the fabricated nature of both the photographs and text messages, alongside the information Amanda had uncovered about Patricia's recent, extensive reconnection with Christine. I want to describe watching my husband's face as this information landed, watching him move through what appeared to be genuine, devastating stages of realization, initial resistance, refusing to fully accept that his own mother could have constructed something this elaborate and cruel, followed by a slower, more painful acceptance as the specific forensic evidence made continued denial increasingly untenable. "I need to talk to my mother," he said, finally, his voice carrying a kind of hollow devastation I'd genuinely never heard from him before. "I need to understand how she could do this, why she would do this, to both of us." That confrontation between Derek and Patricia, which I wasn't present for, but which Derek later described to me in painful, detailed fragments, apparently unfolded over several hours, Patricia initially attempting to maintain her original narrative before eventually, faced with the same forensic evidence Derek had brought to that conversation, breaking down into what he described as a confused, only partially coherent explanation involving her genuine, long-held belief that Christine represented a better match for Derek, combined with what sounded, from his account, like a genuine, if deeply misguided, conviction that she was ultimately protecting her son's happiness rather than actively, deliberately destroying his marriage through fabricated evidence. She kept saying she did it out of love, Derek told me, during a difficult conversation we had roughly 3 weeks after this entire situation began unraveling. That she'd always known Christine and I were meant to be together, that she'd been quietly maintaining that friendship for years, specifically hoping for an opportunity to eventually bring us back together, and that when you needed surgery, she saw it as exactly the kind of opportunity she'd been waiting for, a moment when you'd be too weak to immediately, forcefully counter whatever she showed me. I want to describe the specific, complicated process of Derek and me attempting to rebuild our marriage in the aftermath of this devastating situation, understanding that while the fabricated affair accusation itself hadn't originated from any genuine failure or betrayal on my part, the underlying speed and completeness of Derek's initial willingness to believe it, without demanding more rigorous verification before essentially ending our marriage in that hospital-adjacent conversation, represented its own significant, painful breach of trust that required considerable work to address, even once the fabrication itself had been fully exposed. "I should have demanded more proof before reacting the way I did," Derek acknowledged, during one of our early reconciliation conversations. I let my mother's specific, detailed narrative override 9 years of actually knowing you. And I did that during the exact week you most needed me to trust you completely rather than believe fabricated evidence from someone I should have questioned far more carefully before acting on anything she showed me. I want to be honest that rebuilding trust after this specific sequence of events took considerably longer and required more deliberate, sustained effort than either Derek or I initially anticipated, even once the fabrication itself had been fully, undeniably exposed. Understanding that your spouse was capable of believing something this devastating about you, acting on it decisively enough to actually remove you from your own home during a moment of genuine medical vulnerability, based on evidence that, upon even minimal careful scrutiny, revealed itself as clearly fabricated, introduced a specific, lingering uncertainty into our marriage that took considerable couples therapy to fully work through. We worked with a therapist, Dr. Bellwether, over the following several months, specifically addressing both the trauma of the fabricated accusation itself and the deeper question of what Derek's rapid, complete willingness to believe it revealed about the underlying resilience of our marriage's foundation. Dr. Bellwether helped us understand that Derek's specific vulnerability to Patricia's manipulation likely connected to years of unaddressed dynamics in his relationship with his mother, patterns of deference and difficulty setting boundaries that had existed throughout his entire life, long before I ever entered the picture, patterns that Patricia had, in this specific devastating instance, deliberately and calculatedly exploited. Derek's relationship with Patricia has been fundamentally, permanently altered by everything that happened. He maintains limited, carefully boundaried contact with her now, a significant shift from the closer, more frequent relationship they'd shared throughout most of his adult life before this situation revealed the depths of what she was actually capable of when she believed the outcome justified the method. I've heard, through occasional updates Derek shares, that Patricia has expressed what he describes as partial remorse, though he's noted that her explanations still carry an underlying insistence that her fundamental goal, bringing him back together with someone she genuinely believed was a better match, remained, in her own mind, a legitimate one, even as she's acknowledged the specific methods she used were wrong. I want to describe my own complicated feelings about Christine throughout this entire situation, understanding, once the full picture became clear, that she herself appeared to have had no direct knowledge of or involvement in Patricia's fabrication scheme, remaining, as far as any of us could determine, genuinely unaware that Patricia had been actively working, for reasons entirely her own, to manufacture a crisis in Derek's marriage specifically to create an opening for reconnection between them. I've never spoken with Christine directly about any of this, understanding that whatever complicated role she occupied in this entire situation, she wasn't actually the architect of what happened to me. It's been just over 2 years since I woke up from that surgery to find a packed suitcase waiting by our front door. Derek and I remain married, having navigated what I genuinely believe, with the significant benefit of extensive therapy and considerable deliberate effort, a stronger, more clearly boundaried relationship than what we had before this entire crisis forced both of us to more directly confront underlying dynamics. His relationship with his mother, my own tendency to avoid difficult confrontations rather than address them directly, that had existed, largely unexamined, throughout our earlier years together. I want to be honest that rebuilding wasn't a straightforward or quick process, even once the fabrication itself had been definitively proven. There were months where I found myself watching Derek closely, some part of me still braced for a repeat of that initial, devastating willingness to believe something so completely false about me. Dr. Bellwether helped me understand that this heightened vigilance was a natural, expected response to genuine trauma, not something to feel ashamed of or rush to move past before I was actually ready. I think, often, about the specific calculation embedded in Patricia's choice of timing, understanding that she apparently believed my physical vulnerability during surgical recovery represented an ideal opportunity precisely because she assumed I'd be too weak, too disoriented, to properly, forcefully counter whatever fabricated narrative she constructed. I take a particular, quiet satisfaction in understanding that this specific calculation proved wrong, that even while genuinely physically vulnerable, I found the strength, with the crucial help of my sister and my attorney, to methodically dismantle a lie sophisticated enough that it had, for several devastating weeks, convinced my own husband of a betrayal I never actually committed. If you've ever faced an accusation this fabricated, this deliberately timed to exploit a moment of genuine vulnerability, I want to hear how you found the strength and resources to fight back against it. I used to believe that clear, simple honesty would naturally, quickly overcome any false accusation, that truth inherently reveals itself given enough time and reasonable conversation. I've learned, in the most disorienting way possible, that a sufficiently sophisticated, deliberately constructed lie can temporarily override even years of genuine, earned trust, and that sometimes protecting the truth requires considerably more active, determined effort than simply, passively waiting for it to become self-evident on its own.